The session is titled Finding a Voice, Criticism. And the panel features Saikat Majumdar, Aditya Sudarshan, Anjum Hasan in conversation with Sukrita Paul Kumar. Sukrita ji is a well-known poet and critic, and I'll let her introduce her other co-panelists. Over to you. Actually, I've not really gone, so but can I just request everyone to do a quick introduction? I know Anjum, of course, but it would just be easier if everyone did a quick introduction.
Hi, my name is Saikat Majumdar. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a fiction writer and a critic. My newest book is the novel The Firebird, set in the world of theatre. And I have published an earlier novel, Silverfish, and a book of criticism, Prose of the World. And I teach world literature at Stanford University. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aditya Sudarshan. I am a novelist. I published 3 novels. The latest one was published this year. It's called The Persecution of Mamla Tripathi. I also write plays and scripts for political satire show on TV. And I also write literary criticism now and then in the Hindi Literary Review mainly.
Yeah, I'm Sukrita, and I'm in contradiction, I say, with kind of poetry doesn't really go very well with criticism on the one hand, but criticism does go very well with the academic avatar of mine, because I have been teaching for the last 3 decades or more, and I try to sort of divide myself into 2. One is the poet self and one is the academic critic. And so I have been thinking a lot about both Indian writing in English and also particularly in the context of Hindi and Urdu fiction. I work on Hindi and Urdu fiction, and I write in English on Hindi and Urdu fiction. But primarily a poet now, I'm getting to be less and less of a critic.
Hi, I'm Anjum Hasan. I write novels. I have published 3. The latest is The Cosmopolitans that I was just speaking about a little while ago in this room. I have also published a book of short stories, a book of poems. I have not written criticism in book form, but I have been a very, very interested critic, reviewing the work of my peers, both in fiction and poetry, almost from the very start, as I started out as a writer. The criticism, if you could call it that, because it often actually took the form of book reviews, went hand in hand with my writing my own work. And for the last 5 years, I've been editor, literary editor, books editor at Caravan magazine.
Yeah, so I'm supposed to be in conversation with the 3 of you, and I'm very happy to be one of the senior academics and critic, right, talking to 3 wonderful writers out here, young writers who have really, I think, identified their voices already. So we're looking at finding the voice in this one. And I really feel very good talking to you, the 3 of you, because I come with a certain baggage of my own, which may be, to some extent, my own conflict with, still terribly concerned with the idea of writing that goes on in other languages in India. I wouldn't say versus, I would say and writing that goes on in English. But one of the conclusions that I come to, rightly or wrongly, which is for you to discuss, is that when one is writing in English, I have a feeling, and I say that out of my own experience when I write poetry, that there is a very strong bilinguality at work while one is writing in English. It's also got to do with the language that we are struggling, not struggling, but at least mooring in the context of at least one other Indian language apart from English. It could be Hindi, it could be Marathi, it could be Konkani, it could be any other. And the fact that one chooses to write in English doesn't mean that there is a divorce from the Konkani self or the Marathi self or whatever. So there is a certain kind of bilinguality that emerges in the voice. So I think when we are talking about identifying this voice, the first question that comes to my mind is, to what extent is one self-conscious? Is there any self-consciousness about it? Because there is also, I want to relate it to the idea of what kind of English which was the question of the earlier generation, not your generation. We were very concerned about what kind of English. Are we on the right path? Are we doing it? Are we working well with an English which has a shadow of a strong Punjabi and so on? We were conscious about it, and yet we tried to find our own voices. But today one notices, after Raja Rao started talking long time ago, Raja Rao, when he talked about how thinking in Kannada but maybe writing in English, how does that culture transfer itself in English? And what is the rhythm that is found? I think we have come of age now, and though these questions are not discussed as much as I feel they should be, but I would like you to reflect, if you can, on your own bilinguality and not the conflict, but the coming together of 2 or 3 languages within English. So can we start with you, Saikat?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I actually tend to think that what I call the most artificial art form, and I'm using the word artificial not in any kind of evaluative sense, but in a purely neutral sense, that it's the one art form which uses a medium which is fully artificial. In that any relationship to the senses, that language is fully a creation of social agreement, that we agree that this word means this. And there's of course a lot of linguistic research on this, that that dog and God could just be interchangeable. There's no reason why dog is called God and God is. And what this means is, obviously printed literature as we know it is fairly young, really. It really goes back to the European Enlightenment. And before that, the idea of literature as we talk about did not really even exist. It was oral, it was rooted in performance. In other words, it much more connection with the body, so sound. And we might be headed to an age where the great age of print might be kind of, it's certainly undergoing a change. So that being said, what I feel is the most representative version of print literature, prose fiction, because poetry has a very oral component. Poetry has a sensual component. It's to be heard. So when rhyme works not according to language, the way we understand senses, and whereas prose or fiction is the one form which can be completely abstracted. And this actually has a very interesting relationship with the question of verisimilitude, which is, which brings back to the question of language, that somehow it's more credible to read a century, Rajasthani peasant speaking in English than to see the same thing in a film or in a play. Now this latter is also being done, but the linguistic abstraction in a degree of makes it possible to withhold disbelief more, because you're not really hearing, you're kind of deciphering it. And so this packaging, this has interesting implications, because this for one thing makes the novel most sort of portable. It is clearly the most portable of all literary forms, because it can be packaged and abstracted. I think the art form which travels the least is the play, because the play very rooted in a certain time and place. It's very political, it's sort of product of its soil, and it's also very visceral. It's embodied. Poetry, I think, we're in between, because it also has a visceral element in its sort of in its question of rhyme, but at the same time it is also literary. There's a strong culture of written poetry. So all of these really decides the relationship with language. We don't have the same relationship with language across genres. I primarily prose fiction and non-fiction and criticism, and for me certainly, I've always, my native language I inherited by birth is Bengali, and it always plays a role. When you're talking about dialogue, you try to capture a kind of an alien syntax. You try to write English, which is, that this is a life which is not always being lived in English. There's a kind of an angle, and you preserve that angle as much as you can without making the language clumsy or sort of hindering communication. And of course, that's been a long-going debate in African literature between Achebe and Kogi and all of that. We've come past that. We know that English has proved its ability as to perform in other contexts with a shadow of another vernacular. But I think it's very important that we take the medium into account. because the medium really processes our relationship to language and to what degree a particular experience is embodied and to what degree it's abstracted. I really think that prose is the medium which is capable of abstracting experience to the most. Not that it has to do it all the time, but it's certainly capable of.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to take the dialogue forward from there and perhaps, talk to you in the context of how I would personally think that he's talked about the disembodied experience as well in the case of poetry. But do you see the boundaries, the borders between the two genres so clearly? In your case, you're writing plays as well. So how do you negotiate with this whole idea of disembodiment or owning the medium in a particular way as distinctly different from, say, poetry or prose in general?
Well, I think as a creative writer, you grow in, at least speaking personally, in a kind of mystical way. So it's very difficult to say when how it comes about that you've written short stories, then you've written a novel, then you've written a play, or what you will write next. It's not necessarily something which you're so consciously aware of. But what I did want to say, coming back to the the question you were raising about self-consciousness in English and of course criticism, which is what we're talking about, I always felt, and I continue to feel, that an acute self-consciousness about English is very evident in literary criticism as regards Indian English fiction. And I remember when I was, before I even wrote, it used to surprise me that a good review, reviewers who are considered good, their idea of a good review was sort of parsing sentences and holding up sentences to examine that, look at the grammar in this sentence, or this metaphor is not well turned, and so on. There is more to writing a novel or to writing a story than the quality of your sentences. But this is, and it shows at a very banal level that you're still worried about, am I speaking English correctly? How good is your English? And I think that state of affairs has continued even to date, because what I see as regards criticism is that it's kind of abandoned Indian English fiction. It will look at anything else but Indian English fiction. It takes a great interest in non-fiction. It may take a passing interest in fiction from the rest of South Asia. It is at present taking a great interest in vernacular fiction, and this is all very well, but it doesn't address the problem that writers in English have, which is that you need critics, and that's the other thing. Critics are an essential part of the literary infrastructure, because not only do they help readers, of course, understand what is being produced and what are the themes which X writer or Y writer is dealing with, or writers as a group are dealing with, and they help writers as well. A writer who does not have this kind of sort of curatorial help, you're floundering, because it's much more difficult for you to know, okay, where am I actually going? You need critics, and because we haven't had that, I think that's part of the reason why Indian English fiction, no one can say it's doing well. I remember a line from Naipaul, I think in A Writer's People. He says that India cannot judge, and India's standards of judgments are still, who has won an award where, what is the size of so-and-so's advance. I read a piece in the Open magazine where Ravi Singh said nothing has changed in 50 years, and I think it's a startling thing to say, but you can't argue with it. He says the size of print runs remains the same, and a book will still do well depending on the stamp it's received at the outset. So I just want to say that as far as I'm concerned, there is quite a crisis of criticism.
This is very intriguing, because I know that critics are not very popular in general, right? So they speak to each other in the academic world, if at all. And I remember at one point of time, going through a wonderful piece from Waiting for Godot. And in that bit, one of the abuses that is hurled out to one character is, "Oh, you critic," So it's like an abuse. And I think that's really capturing the general trend in general. An author is generally not bothered but at least pretends not to be bothered about the critic. But taking off from what you said in the context of a vacuum in the critical world, in spite of the fact that there is a kind of, at a glance, if you were to look at it, starting, say, from Raja Rao to Salman Rushdie to Arundhati Roy, I think immediately there is a critical tradition, and I'm sure, Keki, you would bear me out when I say when you are writing, you are conscious of that tradition somewhere. Subconsciously, consciously, you are fitting in somewhere, though you're trying to find, everybody, all authors try to find their own voices in there. But what I'm saying is that there is, at a glance, a certain kind of a tradition, flow of a tradition. But yes, all the names that I've taken are authors, not critics, right? So except, yeah, of course. But the kind of talking that happens usually when T.S. Eliot, I think in the early 20th century, when he told himself, oh my God, I will write criticism to make place for my own works. Because there were new works that he was trying, new ways of writing that he was experimenting with. And so he wrote, say, an essay on poetic drama before writing poetic dramas, So he had to do that kind of work. Do you feel that pressure, that there's no critic and therefore you have to make your own space, therefore, with a great deal of difficulty, because you don't know how you're going to be taken, so theoretical parameters somewhere need to be set up. Thank God that we have these book launches and we have conversations and we have literary festivals where these issues are coming up. So it is in one sense a kind of finding your own voice through these conversations. But do you feel the need for a critic, Anjum? Do you feel that, do you feel the lack of a critic?
Yeah, 2 or 3 things. I'd like to respond to what Saikat said, which was very, very fascinating to me as a practitioner of the novel, as a novelist, about the prose form really being the most flexible and mobile and portable. And I think especially as somebody who grew up in the Northeast and who writes in her fiction and in her poetry and short stories about, not about the Northeast in an ethnographic sense, but about experiences that are located there, it's really fascinating how much orality still exists in that culture. And again, I'm not talking about this in an ethnographic sense, not the folk, but the everyday contemporary. I mean, you could be walking down a street in Shillong and you would be hearing so many languages. And these languages do not necessarily have very developed literary cultures, but they're amazed the vernacular richness of these. And it always strikes me, there should be forms which are not printed necessarily, which are not literary in the way that we understand literature, that can capture this vernacular richness, and maybe theatre, maybe new forms of poetry. But I think that things like that really are waiting to happen in India. Maybe we will see, maybe the internet or video will allow this vernacular richness. Because so far we've thought of vernacular richness in very Sarkari ways. You know, we are a country with so many languages, each should be given its due. The ones that are not, the languages that are not in the 8th schedule, their representatives are constantly fighting, protesting for the languages to be included so they get their due as official languages. So it's a very bureaucratic approach to language, but as a creative approach, we really have, I think, not even touched the tip of the iceberg, and that really has to come from within the speakers of the language, from within the people who have literary ambitions. See what you can do if you're a speaker of, say, one of the many languages of Nagaland, or one of the many languages of Mizoram, or one of the many languages of Manipur. How can we, so that to me is a constant preoccupation as somebody who's actually cut off from that as a writer in English, but is trying to draw that through that translation or that transmutation that Saikat talked about into English. So that's one thing about language and literature in India. The thing about the critic is I think we are working with some very, very strong preconceived notions of what is literary when we write and read criticism. And especially in poetry, but I think this also affects the way we read prose. There is, for instance, the idea of beauty, the idea of the beautiful, and perhaps it's coming from the Romantic poets. But often when you read reviews of poetry, there is a very oppressive idea of the beautiful in poetry. which sort of kind of takes over a review of poetry. The other idea is the Indian. How do we judge a poem or a poet on the basis of their being Indian or not? And sometimes you go back to Sanskrit poetics, sometimes you look at older writers in the Indian languages, but constantly there's some kind of need to hark back to create an idea of Indian, and a kind of, I think to my mind, undervaluing of the modern in the Indian experience. So to be Indian does not necessarily mean that you need some reference to, some harking back to antiquity, but we feel very strongly, I've noticed the need to do that. And to your final question about creating a space, so where do you negotiate your own work? Or do you negotiate your own, or create a space for your own work? As somebody who's both a critic and a practitioner, I think we need to do that. I think there is definitely a need, and I don't think it's been done enough. I think I can think of 2 or 3 people maybe who've done that, who work in English, inevitably are drawing from other languages as we all are, but who have very strongly held on to their own experience of the language and their own very, very modern positions as people who were born after the British. They are not that much older people that they are saying that we have come through some kind of post-colonial experience and are therefore, they are much younger people. So in that sense, modern. And I'm thinking, for instance, of Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who is a translator of Hindi poetry, translator of Kabir, also writes in English, has written about his contemporaries very, very wonderfully. And I'll just end with one thing that he said, which I think is a wonderful thing to hold on to, because we started with bilinguality. He is reacting to an essay on A.K. Ramanujam, and the critic was Harper Lear. Now he completely challenges this kind of layered hierarchy of thinking about language, and I see it recurring all the time. Recently I was reviewing a book by Vikram Chandra, and he says the same thing. In my deepest self, I was Indian. In my deepest self, I believed in reincarnation. And I think that metaphor itself could be said to be faulty, because it creates an idea of the authentic self that is then superimposed with the colonial or the English. And Arvind's that one essay, I can't recall the name now, but it was published in a wonderful anthology, the Picada Anthology of Modern Indian Literature, edited by Amit Chaudhary. And to me, that is one of the most sort of groundbreaking essays about how we can read Indian literature and how we can break away from the existing, very, very jaded, to my mind, paradigms in which we think about the bilingual writer.
Yeah.
In fact,
I was just going to, talking of binaries, I mean, it's really interesting that we're talking of criticism, and I know it's very customary to talk about criticism and practice, and the critic and the practitioner, and I actually don't always think in these lines. I think criticism is continuous with literature, and I think Arvind, or Amit, people who definitely agreed. And for me, the kind of unifying thing is that they foreground a subjective vision. That when criticism foregrounds a subjective vision, and this is how literature is actually different from the social sciences. Social sciences are primarily interested in collectivities, collective behavior, but literature loses it. Of course, it has a social scientific quality also, but it loses its identity if it gives up its affiliation to the subjective and the idiosyncratic. And in this, I think this conscious drawing attention to the subjective is what, of course, criticism is a genre, just the way poetry is a genre, fiction is a genre, criticism is a genre, but there's no fundamental qualitative difference. I mean, the distinction I draw is scholarship in my mind is different. Because scholarship in my mind takes a kind of concrete, maybe ethnographic problem out there and attacks it, and there's a sense of sacrifice of the subjective self. But there is criticism which kind of emanates from the self of the author, people like Susan Sontag, people like, I mean, Virginia Woolf's essays, George Orwell's essay, Closer Home, people like Amit Chaudhary, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Anjum, you have written this yourself. So this sense that it's really a kind of a personal adventure among works of art. So in a sense where the personal and the archive are held in a kind of non-hierarchical relationship. When you sacrifice the personal to foreground the archive, it becomes scholarship. And another thing which I think is very crucial is we think of the intellectual as something abstract, and then there's the artistic, which has the body as at its heart. So that's why I talked about the bodily. And I think this is something T.S. Eliot got to it long time back when he talked about the main problem was dissociation of sensibility. That to think has somehow become different from to feel. And Milton was the big culprit in his mind that somehow, and his big dream was the poet should be able to unify the sound of a typewriter, falling in love, reading Spinoza, and the smell of cooking. So the intellectual, the olfactory, the emotional, and the auditorial, everything. And this kind of unified sensibility is what is extremely important. And in my mind, the best criticism, the criticism that I admire the most, is actually sensual, is bodily. Susan Sontag writes about this famously against interpretation, that what is interpretation but just simply translation to another language. You look at a couple fighting and then you say this is barbarism versus civilization. So you make it abstract. You make it not Blanche and what's the name of Street Called Desire. You sort of substitute the character, you give them types. So you're simply translating, you're simply making abstract. And criticism has often become this process of abstraction because it's hard to talk about individual cases. And pedagogy functions on this. Pedagogy makes abstraction, pedagogy creates theory. But the best criticism in my mind actually incorporates the bodily. Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas. It's a kind of polemical interference into a public sphere problem. Her war. And she ends up providing a formula, how can we feminize the public sphere? But she does it in a kind of in a very sensual way. When she talks about in her famous essay, Hours in a Library, that a reader is like this athlete, this open air creature, and a scholar is like this musty, he loves musty indoors. And I think she's achieved something amazing here. She's made an argument using a metaphor. That she's not made an argument using data or facts, but she's actually made an argument through visual metaphor.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it would be a very good idea, the examples that you're giving, I think it would be a very good idea if you were to identify, yes, apart from Arvind Kumar Mehrotra and one or two others. I think if we can pause and think a little bit about, criticism that is happening in other languages in India apart from English. Is this a malaise only with English that we are not really able to come out with the critical tradition, the identification of critical tradition? Because I was just now thinking of, say, Hindi, for instance. In Hindi, you have Hazari Prasad Bedi and Nambar Singh, people who have been actually looking at Dusri Parampara, right? And Urdu, you have Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, who's really dealing with it in a very significant way, trying to negotiate, trying to find out where is it that the departures happen from Persian and where are the continuities, because there's a sense of long tradition, coming from ancient times almost. But in the case of English, it's relatively, obviously, it's far more modern, right? And little tradition in one sense. But the way I think English writing has taken space in India, and that doesn't match up to the critical writing that is happening on it. So what is happening? Are we kind of divorced from the academic world? Is that it? Because I think the academics are teaching lots of universities are going on with Indian writing in English as a full paper at the undergraduate level and so on, and even higher levels. So sometimes I wonder, does it have anything to do with the fact that we have not philosophically developed that tradition of synthesis between analytical thinking and what we call shlokas? It's a matter of faith on the one side, and on the other hand, an analysis that comes from the West in the early 20th century, the big Veda tradition. But we haven't got it together. So we are not really, it's not a philosophic tradition that we have really built up, and therefore criticism is not coming up. in the way that it should.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, of course, is that English is the language which has been the most traumatized artistically in terms of, I mean, you see it in movies as well. I mean, how many movies do we make in English, right? And you look at the people who are making the movies, they're English speakers, but for various reasons, it doesn't translate to artistic output. So, therefore, this issue of, I mean, what it means is that a critic in the English language is going to have to get their hands dirty in a way that critics in the other languages, which have longer and deeper traditions and just a greater body of high quality work, they don't need to. I mean, a critic in English does not have the luxury of having this, these works to parse. He or she has to kind of engage with a very fledgling, floundering sort of output. And I think that's something which perhaps our critics have shied away from. I mean, they would rather work with good books, albeit not in English. Whereas, somebody has to get things going, right? If somebody does not take the trouble to help something grow, it is not going to achieve a tradition ever. I mean, it doesn't happen automatically, that's for sure. And the other thing is that, as Saikat was saying, I mean, I do agree that writers have critical faculties, and some, of course, more than others. But because criticism can function at various levels of abstraction, a writer may be marvelously skilled at say, I remember, for example, Robert Louis Stevenson. The sort of stuff he wrote just about the use of language and things which arranging sentences differently, the different effects which that has. It's very deep and it's very strong. But that's at one level of abstraction. You also need criticism which is more prosaic, so to speak, which is looking at what are the books being written and what are the themes being explored and where are we headed as a kind of body of work. And I don't know if writers necessarily have been able to do that. At least in the context of Indian English writing, I don't think they've been able to do that, which means that you again come back to the need for a critic. And I really think that until this is accepted, that you need the critic and that you are not doing well, there's not likely to be any improvement. I mean, individuals can do well in their careers, but as a body of work, your Indian English literature is not going to do well until you first accept that it has a neediness for a critical framework.
I think criticism is also a form of self-imagining, and therefore I would agree with Saikat completely that the most interesting traditions of criticism, literary criticism, are actually by the practitioners themselves. And certainly in the Indian case, and I don't think it's only true of English. If you look at, for instance, Hindi, and the fact that the longest running magazine in the language, Hans, was started by a writer, folded up, was revived by a writer, continues today. And if you look at certain formations, the progressive writers movement, the Nai Kahani movement, these are all writers coming together, sometimes with a political aim, sometimes with an aim that seems political but is actually very, very literary, and are saying these are the kind of things we would like to do. So actually, it has always been a literary urge, and I think your T.S. Eliot example at the beginning was wonderful, because he's a very interesting example of someone who's creating a tradition in order to fit into it. So I think we have to be aware of, having said that the most interesting criticism, the most sensuous, is actually created by writers, the most telling, the most revealing. How does that work in the case of Indian English writing? I think maybe one of the obstacles and the reasons why we don't have more, and we should have more, is that this is a very dispersed body of people. Physically, mentally, we are living in different places and coming out of very, very different backgrounds, right? What does a poet living in Shillong, say, let me give the example of a wonderful poet called Robin Gangong, of Manipuri origin, has spent the last 30, 40 years in Shillong, writes in English. He's an Indian writer in English. What does he have in common with Jhumpa Lahiri? Right? What does he have in common even with Jayanta Mahapatra? So all of us, much more I think than in a language like Hindi or Bengali, have very dispersed backgrounds. So I think we need to think of literature itself differently when we're thinking of Indian English writing, simply because its sources are so different.
Anjum, taking over from what you said, I think it's a very significant point that you're making. However, I feel that these challenges by now we should have started to grapple with. The reason to me it is. You know why? Because what you're talking about is, say, in one sense, if I can, for short of any other word, maybe localization that happens, rootedness that happens, say, by a poet who is in Shillong, or a poet who's sitting in, say, Stanford and writing, or another poet or a writer who's writing in South India. Of course, these are this takes me to that other point that I was making to start with. There is another set of languages at work with, languages and cultures that are at work with the English that you are using. So the English, which means also a sensibility, a culture and everything, interacts with that rootedness in a particular way, and something different happens in English language then, as a product.
Challenge the idea that the Indian language is the one that makes you rooted, and then that is
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the kind of synthesis that is happening, the coming together that is happening, and then it finds itself, expressed in a certain kind of English, which I am calling bilingual, but it could be called something else. But we have not struggled enough to really, I'm telling myself as well, because I've been writing criticism, but I'm also saying that we need to work at that to be able to identify whether one is a poet or writer or not. But I think we need to grapple with that reality, and which doesn't mean we are looking at being Indian, like we're not homogenizing. But what are these specificities that happen, peculiarities that happen in different regions, which are rooted and yet transcending, So how do we identify it? How do we classify it? Is there a need to do it? Is the writer looking for that? Because if there isn't that strengthening of a certain kind of a tradition, perhaps there would be insecurities.
Well, when you say classify, that's where I would because I'm not so interested in taxonomy and the abstraction. I'm interested in the experience. I would be much more interested if someone like Jhumpa Lahiri or Robin Gangong then wrote about their particular experience of developing and their creative sources, their journey, and therefore their, to use Amit's phrase, clearing a space for themselves. We have less of that. We don't necessarily need the external taxonomizing, but we certainly do need more of the experience, and I think there's not enough of that.
That's where I think criticism, my mind becomes continuous with writing. In fact, I'm not even comfortable with the sort of term writer and critic, because a critic is a writer too, unless you're expressing your criticism in song or performance, you're writing. So you are all writers. I mean, a historian is a writer is kind of on the other hand, for me, the terms a critic, a scholar, and an academic are very different terms. I mean, an academic is somebody who simply works in an academy. And in the US these days, most poets and fiction writers are academics because they are salaried teachers, so that makes them all academics. And I think that that the criticism for the kind of this narrative of the self, which Anjum you're talking about, the narrative of the self, is you're simply providing the narrative of the self in a different genre. You're bringing in kind of an abstract narrative to combine with your sensual experience. So poetry is a narrative of the self, criticism can be a narrative of the self too. And that is something which I think, and why this is lacking in India may have something to do with the sort of the larger question of to what degree literature is a Western art form. I mean, Jane Kujia has a wonderful piece in Elizabeth Costello that the novel in Africa, that the novel is an alien form in Africa, and it's kind of an ironic piece where the speaker is not to be trusted because it's all about orality, we perform the body, and it's kind of very exotic African masculinity. But the point is it's really rooted in a kind of, European Enlightenment of the 18th century, the culture of printing, the culture of modernity, the culture of capitalism, the growth of the middle class, all of these things. Now, there's a real question to what degree literature as a kind of written form is natural outside this location in Europe. It has, of course, been globalized thanks to colonialism. It has spread all over the world. But it's kind of worth asking whether our tradition of criticism is more geared towards the aesthetics on the whole, on Natya, on Rasa, whether it is really, it really took literature as an archive. There was grammar, there was diplomacy, but literature, to what degree was it even a kind of natural form, whether it's a creation of colonial modernity? Certainly I can say with the question of Bengal Renaissance, which was a great flowering of Bengali literature, would not even exist without the encounter with the British. It is completely a creation of colonial modernity. Now I know that's not true of many other cultures, other linguistic groups in India which would have a real life, sort of predate the British colonials. But I think the lack of criticism in India may have something to do with the lack of the sense of literature itself as a kind of indigenous art form as opposed to the other performances.
I don't know enough to agree or disagree about whether this has been a factor. Perhaps it has been a factor, but I also think one other reason could be that we don't talk about literature enough in an experiential sense, the narrative of the self, is that literature and language is so politicized in India. And that ramification of that political way of thinking is there even in the ordinary 500-word review that you read, which is that everything written in Indian languages is good because it is authentic. Most of what is written in Indian English is a product of the market, as if the market has not touched Indian languages and we are this new beast created out of the market. Everything in Indian writing in English that is translated is unreadable because translations by definition are bad, and so we will never be able to access this wonderful original soul of Indian literature because it does not work in translation. Most of it is either untranslatable or it's badly translated. So it's all these myths, that we operate with, which are never, and I'm not saying that they are necessarily true or not true, but they're definitely myths that we need to examine. And that is also, I think, one reason why they function as obstacles to thinking in other ways about our literature.
I think one of the reasons why I started to talk about bilinguality was precisely this, because I think right now I'm handling a huge project on translation. And this translation, the translators constantly ask, what kind of English? Is it okay to bring in Indian beautiful Urdu words or Hindi words or whatever they are translating from? So, this negotiation between languages in creative writing as much as in translation needs to be acknowledged and valued, I think. I think on that note we could stop because I've been getting signals from there. And thank you very much for your